Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Obviously, today we're going to be talking about LoadNinja, which we're super excited to jump into. This is a super new innovation that we came out with. It's actually a product that we developed in-house. So we're so excited to jump into a little bit more about why we created it and what the story is and how you can get started. So my name is Saoirse Hinksman. I'm a marketing manager here at SmartBear, and I also have Keshav with me, who's our product manager for LoadNinja. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much, Saoirse, and I'm really excited to be on this webinar and walk you through LoadNinja's capabilities together today.
All right. So just to give you guys a little bit of an idea as to what we're going to go through today, today we're going to talk about what the load testing market looks like at the current moment and kind of give you a little bit of context as to what spurred the need for a tool like LoadNinja and how we kind of got started developing what would be the most useful for load testing teams today. And then we'll go over what LoadNinja is, how it can benefit your teams, and then specifically get into the platform and go through a couple of the scenarios and use cases that you guys will be familiar with. So what are some of the challenges that you can overcome by using LoadNinja? And then we'll open up the floor for a Q&A. And I know a few of you have seen it as I had asked you guys to help me out with the sound check here, but Zoom actually has a Q&A feature and a chat feature. So if you have any questions at any point, feel free to type them into the Q&A in the chat, and I'll try and get to them as we go along. And if I don't get to them in that exact moment, don't worry. I'll read them through during the Q&A, and we can get those answered for you. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to you, Keshav, and we can get started.
Awesome. Thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much, Saoirse, for that great introduction. So let's dive right in. This is common. We've been looking at the market and load testing extensively for a long time. And, in general, if you look at the way software development has evolved over the course of, over the last 30, 40 years, it's always been to keep up with the growing demands of consumers. And consumers as a whole, right now in today's day and age, there's a digital saturation for consumers. You and me, we're both tech consumers today. And if you notice, there's technology, there's applications, there's software in every single aspect of life that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. And so because of this, we're extremely picky as consumers. And two, we move from one platform to the next if our expectations of great features, great functional quality in the existing features, and finally, good high-performance applications, those expectations are not necessarily met. Right, and software development, software product teams who are passionate about building great products have always done their best to adopt and adapt with the growing needs of consumers. They've adopted great new methodologies in order to deliver applications faster with different features. For example, with Agile and DevOps, the whole point is to deliver new enhancement as well as fix existing issues much faster and release them into the market. And also there's been some interesting and new testing methodologies like the shift left testing that advocates for testing much earlier on in the development cycle and making QA the central focus of the development and delivery. These methodologies have all evolved in order to meet these growing demands of consumers. Now, specifically, if we narrow in on Agile, DevOps, and shift left testing, what we've seen is the engineering component of building an application has adopted pretty well, right? So that's why you have different methodologies, you have different tools, like IDEs, for example, have had all these. There's been some great progress in the space of IDEs in order to make sure development can happen much quicker. Functional testing tools, including our very own Test Complete, for example, they've all adopted in order to meet the growing needs of consumers, allowing them to allowing product teams to test on the fly and programmatically drive them and incorporate them into their development cycle. However, performance testing, if you think about it, is still looked at as the centralized monolithical function that many product teams are scared to even touch. Right? There will be enterprises. We have a few customer prospects already and customers on this webinar right now who are from enterprises, and they can attest to this. when we think about performance testing, it's looked at like this big black box. And product teams, even teams who are passionate about building great products and want to build high performing products, don't necessarily know where to get started. Or once they get started, it becomes hard for performance testing tools to keep up with the growing pace of software development and delivery. And this is because primarily software load testing tools have not really made much strides over the last 20, 30 years in the load testing ecosystem. Now, if you think about it traditionally, when we looked at the market and looked at specifically load testing tools that existed, we found a few deficiencies. The first deficiency, we think, is how inefficient right now, even to this day, it is to create and playback test scripts. Now, traditionally, if you think about it, applications at the end of the day return some sort of dynamic responses from the server, right? Many applications use dynamic values that change every time. Now, with that said, when a load testing tool right now in today's day and age, most load testing tools are built use record test scripts using a protocol recorder. Right? The whole point of the protocol recorder is to capture all of the HTTPS traffic and interactions between the server to the client. Now, as I mentioned before, many applications use dynamic values that changes over time, right? So you as a performance tester have to do something called correlation in order to make sure that these dynamic responses are carried forwarded from the server to the client and from the client to the server. So like, correlation is the process of capturing and storing all of the dynamic responses from the server and passing it on to subsequent responses, right? So this means that you have to make sure, for example, all the cookies, for example, the cookie information and all of the other contextual information are stored and then passed on to the right transactions when going from the server to the client, right? So this is primarily how recording and playing back test scripts occur. So this is a very, very tedious process. So while recording is relatively easy in all of these existing tools, playing back involves this process of correlation. And a typical example of correlation I'll tell you is like, for example, you would have to identify all the dynamic values in all of that huge voluminous chunk of HTTP or HTTPS traffic that you've just recorded. Then you'll have to like find all the server responses containing the dynamic values. Then you'd have to capture that dynamic value in a parameter, replace every single occurrence of the dynamic value with the parameter, and then verify changes during playback. To get a script ready for playback involves a lot of tedious process and overhead. Typically, a load tester would be spending about 50 to 60% of their entire time just correlating. Right? And so this doesn't necessarily make, the whole point of load testing is to test, but if you're spending about 60% just getting the script ready for testing, that actually adds a lot of overhead to get the application ready for the load testing process. Then we have the capturing of client-side calls itself for playback. Right? If you know, over the last 10, 15 years, Ajax client-side JavaScript has become extremely popular. Right? You will have, for example, client-side changes within the application that don't necessarily communicate with the server. Right? For example, like you would have a pop-up, for example, that triggers every time you add items to your checkout to the cart in your e-commerce application. That doesn't necessarily have to communicate directly with the server, but that is still part of the consumer experience, and that is still part of the experience that you want to performance test. And because existing tools record traffic from the protocol level for the test script, you will not necessarily be able to directly capture this transaction because there is no traffic that's going from the client to the server for executing these client-side calls. So in order to do this, in order to make sure that you can actually capture these client-side changes, you have to essentially go through like additional scripting and massaging. This is a well-known limitation of open source tools like JMeter, for example, because JMeter is not a browser, and thus it has an inability to execute JavaScript, specifically over here, client-side JavaScript. And so JMeter, as well as like all the other commercial tools that use JMeter under the hood, face this issue. And so you have to do a lot more additional scripting, probably have to download some external plugins in order to get it ready for playback when you're actually capturing client-side interactions. The second deficiency is when you're using proprietary load generators. Every single tool in the market right now uses its own version of a load emulation agent. The whole point of these emulation agents is to simulate load. And their goal is to be as close to real world as possible. And it's a good intention, right? These emulation agents, they do want to mimic the real world scenario of realistic load. However,